what I plan to do in the course of the next few minutes, I want to offer just one or two reflections on the English housing market. Let me just say, another thing I was asked to do in presenting this, and Porrick sent me all sorts of background details, I had to make it a very European presentation and with lots of reference to what's going on in other countries. My computer then crashed and died, and all that background information is lost in cyber hell, I think. So I'm afraid to say I'm going to talk almost exclusively about my English experience, and I'm also going to be concentrating in particular on the rental side of housing, not the owner-occupation side of housing. But I hope that you will agree, given the nature of the audience, that apart from one or two of you who will know an awful lot about what I'm going to say, I hope nonetheless you will find what I have to say interesting and helpful. Anyway, I'll talk a little bit about the English housing market and how the linkage between housing and consumer protection, consumer law developed. I do want to talk about the Law Commission programme that I had the privilege of leading for the best part of 7.5 years between 2001 and 2008. It consisted of 3 reports, one called Renting Homes, another one on dispute resolution, and a third on responsible renting, and I will say a little bit more about that as I go along. I'll talk briefly about subsequent developments, both within the English political context, but also in the wider UK context. And having heard the Minister here speaking, I think some of the things that we've been struggling with might be of some resonance to the Irish government too, as they think about the green or white paper that is obviously promised for the autumn. And then I'll have a few closing remarks. So that's the agenda. Issues in the housing market. Well, unlike Spain, where there are millions of houses which are just standing around there empty and are unaffordable, I suppose the key problem in England is that there just are not enough units of accommodation for all those who need to live in them. The emphasis all the time is on shortages of housing. And we have to remember that. The priority, in my view, has got to be find ways of getting investment so that there is more choice, more availability of housing. There are obviously questions about affordability and so forth, but getting the units on the ground, I think, is important. Reflecting very much the opening session yesterday, when we were reminded of Bill Clinton's assertion that you could only participate, he didn't quite say it this way, but you could only participate in the American dream if you owned your home. Exactly the same rhetoric, not the same language, is adopted in England. There is what I would call a completely unequal political balance, and certainly as a consequence social balance, between house purchase and home rental. And I think this is important because if you're being told the whole time that you are only successful if you're a home purchaser, how does that make you kind of feel if you're not a home purchaser? And let's remember, certainly in the UK or in England, a third of the population are not home owners, they're renters. And I think that this political imbalance is one of the things that is it shows a complete failure of political leadership, in my view. And I will reflect on that again at the end. There's been some quite interesting dynamics in the English rented housing market. For many years, I suppose from the 30s onwards, the principal source of rental housing, particularly for the poor, the less well-off, was through local authorities. There was a large public sector. In the 70s, this was amplified, if you like, the local authority sector was amplified by housing associations, bodies that built on the Victorian tradition, a 19th century tradition of housing charities. And in the 1970s, housing associations, which is the sort of broad term, they were operating with a certain amount of public money, but outside the local authority system. But they were very much the minority flavour. But what has happened is a rebalancing, if you like. Local authority accommodation has reduced in quantity. Housing association has significantly increased. And the most amazing development that has taken place over the last 10 or 15 years has been an enormous revival of the private rented sector. So that if you look at the rented sector as a whole, it's more or less in balance as between the social, which combines local authorities and housing associations, and the private rented sector. That's not something that would have been anticipated, I think, 15 years ago. The big problem with the private rented sector, certainly in the UK, and I think this is different in other countries in Europe, but it's very much what one is sometimes called a mom-and-pop industry. That there are one or two significant landlord players with large portfolios running into thousands, but the typical private sector landlord is someone who owns 1, 2, or 3 units of accommodation. And on the whole, they've not invested in building that. What they've done is they've bought units that happen to be available and then are letting them out. They haven't created, as it were, specialist developments of rent blocks for rentals. So it's if you like, a byproduct of people's affluence, that they can afford 1 or 2 other houses, but there isn't the sort of strategic engagement of large landlords that you find in other countries. And this lack of institutional investment, in a sense, goes back to my opening remark. I think one of the key issues about housing in the UK, housing certainly in the rental sector, is the lack of institutional investment to ensure that new accommodation is provided. And one of the consequences of the lack of institutional investment is that there are still big reputational issues. I mean, when I was at the Law Commission, there was a debate in Parliament and various members of Parliament, particularly on the Labour Party, were standing up and saying things like, you know, the only good private landlord is a dead landlord, and so they didn't quite say it like that, but there is you only have to watch the television. There are always stories of the most appalling examples of private landlordism, rental accommodation in a squalid condition that has been rented out with sparking wires and water coming through the ceiling and so on and so forth. But those reputational issues exist. I don't think they can apply entirely across the board. That, in fact, the social data suggests that, on the whole, private tenants quite like renting privately. But there are reputational issues, and that's one of the issues that I think does affect the English housing market. And it's not helped by the fact that there is a lack of real big, serious players in the rental market. Just to amplify a couple of these, the English Housing Survey, which was published late last year, makes the point. 66% of householders were owner-occupiers in 2010-11. This appears to continue the gradual downturn. So whatever aspiration that politicians may have for England to be a owner-occupation democracy, the English dream, is that as the equivalent of the American dream? I don't know. Anyway, it's failing, certainly at the moment. There's the downturn. And you can see there the social rented sector accounting for 17.5% of households, private rented sector for 16.5%. And in terms of numbers, this very dramatic shift in the balance between the social rented sector and the private rented sector. 30 years ago, local authority and housing associations absolutely dominating the rented sector. Now, the differential number is only about 200,000, and all the indications are that within the next 3 or 4 years, the amount of private rented accommodation in the rented sector is going to exceed that of the social rented sector. So whether you like it or not, you have to take, I think government has to take, the private rented sector seriously. If they mess that up, a huge tranche of currently available housing is simply going to be lost to the market, and that's going to increase problems of homelessness and so on and so forth. So it's a difficult issue for politicians to deal with. Where did this linkage between housing and consumer protection come from? Well, I think in some ways it started way back in the Housing Act 1988. This was legislation which the Conservatives introduced, and one of the things they did in that legislation was to differentiate in that context between local authority housing and housing association housing. Before then, the social sector had, from a legal point of view, been broadly lumped together. It wasn't entirely overlapping legal framework. But the Housing Act 1988 made a sharp distinction. Local authorities had that set of rules, housing associations had that set of rules. And if you look at the debates in the Housing Act, a lot of what we would now call the choice agenda was on the table then as well. William Waldegrave, who was the housing minister, was saying, why shouldn't we give people, quote, trapped in local authorities the opportunity to get out and live in a housing association? So that was very much the thing. And in that context, I mean, if you like, that's part of a sort of consumer approach, but that was very much equating consumers with the poor. I got interested in it because when I was at Bristol University at the time, and there was one of the great gurus of housing policy, a man called Alan Murray, who invited me to join him in writing a paper on the consumer implications of the Housing Act 1988. And it sort of triggered some ideas, and partly he was talking about this issue of choice in the context of the social rented sector. But also, the other big feature of the Housing Act 1988 is that this was the great Thatcher piece of legislation to liberalise the private rented sector. So away went rent control, more or less away went security of tenure. These were to be the new, this was to be the new context within which private landlords were going to be invited to join in the market. And I, at that stage, sort of worried about this. I mean, people kept on saying we want to keep the old regulatory regime. Well, I didn't think that was going to work, but I still thought there was a missed opportunity that in addition to just sweeping away the old rules, one might actually think about new regulatory context that would give more of a consumer protection approach. And I wrote 1 or 2 papers on that. And this drift, if you like, was confirmed in the Housing Act 1996 when there was yet further liberalisation. To be honest, I then sort of forgot about that. I mean, this was a purely personal thing. But meanwhile, the EU had been burrowing away in their sort of consumer protection department, and they produced, what would it be, directives? I can't, to be honest, I can't remember. Anyway, things that became incorporated into English law as the unfair terms in consumer contract regulations. I'm sorry to the translators, I didn't give them the what that abbreviation. But this was part of a big package attacking unfair contract terms. And landlord and tenant contracts, tenancy contracts, were quite clearly within the scope of these regulations. And just as an aside, our Office of Fair Trading, the English Office of Fair Trading, did some very interesting work looking at unfair terms in consumer contracts. You can download their report. It goes on for about 130 pages of clauses found in typical agreements which they thought were being unfair. Well, I was invited to join the Law Commission, as I say, in 2001, and I think one of the issues there was that it was a chance. This was the new Labour government was in control of the government at that stage, And we had at that stage a housing minister, a man called Nick Rainsford, who'd done a lot of work on housing as a social activist before he joined Parliament. He'd worked with Shelter, ran the Shelter Housing Advice Centre. He knew what he wanted, and he was commissioned, he commissioned me and my team to produce a programme that was more structured, more coherent than, I mean, we've got 100 years of housing law going back to at least to 1915, arguably earlier than that. But he wanted a structure that was more coherent, but he also wanted a structure that was more flexible so that it could adapt itself to different changing situations. And the other important thing is that the new Labour government accepted the liberalisation of the private rented sector that the Thatcher government had introduced in the 1988 and the 1996 Housing Acts. So there was no going back. The new Labour government was going to continue with that or live with the consequences of that. So we wrote 3 reports. The first was Renting Homes, which was the, if you like, the traditional law reform report. We analysed the existing law. We came up with proposals for rationalising and changing the law. And we drafted a bill which we thought would be helpful. We also actually, because one of the central elements of this is that we tried to, if you like, link contract and statute. What our recommendation was that the statute should contain the diet of rights and obligations, mutual rights and obligations on both landlords and tenants in the statute, but then these should be accompanied by model contracts which landlords and tenants would be required to have, which would express the statutory provisions in plain language that everybody could understand. One of the great difficulties about a consumer approach in landlord and tenant law in England is that you have contracts, but they don't necessarily reflect at all what the statutory protections offer. We thought this was silly. The other thing that our recommendations would have done is that they would have solved all the unfair terms in consumer contract problems, which landlords told us in the course of our work were getting difficult for them. We also did a paper on proportionate dispute resolution in housing, which I think was quite innovative, and it was linked because our argument was if you got the law clearer, if you had standard contracts, then you could do much more with advice, people working in advice agencies rather than necessarily hiring expensive lawyers working under legal aid. We also wanted to see greater use of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms for resolving disputes, again, without necessarily having to go to court. And we also wrote a report called Encouraging Responsible Renting, which in a way I think is the most innovative part of the work that we did, which was to look at the regulatory approach, particularly for the private rented sector. Effectively, what we were saying is we've had 100 years, more or less, of protective legislation. Legislation has poured out of Parliament, yet it just doesn't work. No one in their right mind is going to, well, at least, very few people are going to take landlords or tenants to court. I mean, okay, there's a lot of stuff goes on in the court, but the typical person doesn't use the court in order to resolve their disputes. So the regulation just wasn't working, and we tried to offer some new ways of thinking about that. Well, what were we trying to do in all of this? Well, first of all, we tried to create a level legal playing field so that the gaps that existed between the social rented sector, the two sides of it, and also the private rented sector, would at least be made more permeable. We weren't saying everybody would have one type of tenancy or another, but we wanted to ensure that it was possible for people to be placed in security, either in local authorities or in housing associations, or in some contexts in the private rented sector. And so we created the possibility of that. We developed very consciously what we call the consumer protection approach to try and ensure that through the written contracts there would be better understanding of mutual rights and obligations, that there were plain language agreements that actually reflected what the law said. We thought of the new approaches to dispute resolution. I'm now repeating myself, analysis of the sensible regulatory approach. But, in a sense, again, reflecting some of the things that were being said yesterday. If you talk to people, particularly lawyers, about housing, landlord and tenant, they want to see it as part of property law. And indeed, other people want to see it as property law as well. We tried to engage the Office of Fair Trading. We tried to engage the consumer movement. They just weren't interested in housing, even though I thought we were doing something that they ought to be very supportive of and taking forward. So, all very frustrating. We produced all these reports. What happened? Well, not a lot, it has to be said. The Labour government did introduce a new agency to regulate actually the social rented sector called the Tenant Services Authority, and they were very sort of in favour of tenants and trying to do all sorts of things. Before you get too excited about them, they were abolished by the Conservative government about 3 years later. The Labour government did introduce tenancy deposit protection, which in a sense is the one single element of consumer protection which has been advanced. We haven't actually dealt with that in our report because we knew work was going on that outside the report. But it's, you know, it's a step forward, and again, you heard the Housing Minister in Ireland saying that this is being actively considered in this context as well. The new Labour government did think about landlord registration, which some people would see as a consumer protective measure. That they were really very unpleasant. You know, we gave them this report, so they instantly said, oh, well, we now have another report. You know, typical bloody civil servants. Anyway, sorry. We might, had there not been a general election which the Labour government lost, we might actually have got the model agreements. There was some civil service interest in building that up. And I think there would have been some enthusiasm for the regulation of letting agents. One of the things that people from outside England may find extraordinary, that although estate agents who buy and sell houses are all regulated, those who let houses don't have to be regulated. And it's estimated that about half of the agents who let houses are completely outside the regulatory framework, which gets up the noses of people who are regulated. The Conservative coalition government, they're against regulation. They're free market. They don't like regulation. Though incidentally, they are in favour of consumer protection. They have decided to retain tenancy deposit protection, but all the rest is out the window. The Localism Act, which is a new piece of legislation that's just come in, has introduced, talk about, I suppose that if I was a bitter man, this would make me feel bitter. All our efforts to simplify and rationalise completely up the spout with the Localism Act. We just introduced how many? 5, 6 more tenants, you know. It's worse than when we started in terms of the number of things. And the question I have for Grant Shapps, if you could ever, he's the Conservative Housing Minister, if you'd ever deign to talk to me, is actually, if you think about it, how do you protect the consumer? You can say you're in favour of consumer protection, but how do you do that without regulation? It seems to me to be in favour of consumer protection, but against regulation, is a completely contradictory and indefensible position. Anyway, nothing much is happening at the moment. Other signs of life, Wales is actually turning out to be really interesting. They're likely to move to regulating the registering of or regulation of letting agents, and there is talk, God knows how secure it's going, about them taking forward some other aspects of our work. The Welsh Assembly government now has legislative powers to deal with housing, and they're producing a white paper sometime in the summer. Scotland has introduced landlord registration. That's always been a separate body of law, but they've gone down that aspect of consumer protection, and they're about to launch tenancy deposit protection in June this year. Northern Ireland is coming on with tenancy deposit protection in the autumn. So all those things have been happening. And I think there's a certain amount happening in the marketplace as well. Local authorities work with the rented sector. They have accreditation schemes. The professional bodies, the people who are regulatory bodies, whether they're of agents or of landlords, actually are trying to do good work, but they're hampered by the fact that there isn't a legislative framework that enables them to develop the standards and the approaches that would deal with some of the reputational issues that bedevils the private rented sector. TDP has offered consumer protection, but the reputational problems remain. The courts, I think, are still an inefficient way of resolving many of the disputes, and I think there is still a fundamental need to clarify the legislation. And one of the things that we were told when we were doing our work was that if, in fact, we did have a new piece of legislation, an indication that government was taking the rented sector seriously, including the private rented sector, that could unlock significant pension fund investment and so on and so forth. But that's an argument that I heard and was attracted by, but it didn't attract either the Labour or the Conservative ministers involved. So what do we achieve? I think we offered a blueprint for policy flexibility. I'm very proud of the work that we did. I think our legal framework could have encouraged private investment if it had been seen imaginatively. And there was a failure, not just at the political level, but also amongst the civil servants, to see the opportunities that we were offering. I think we would have done something constructive for the third of the population that rent. We would have assisted the relationship between tenants and landlords, made them clear about what their mutual rights and responsibilities were. But the fundamental question remains, how do you get politicians to take renting seriously? I've been banging on about this, and the short answer is that I don't know, and the experience of many other countries represented in this conference suggests to me that on the whole, there's nowhere that I know of that has really taken renting seriously. But if you don't, then I think you're condemning a substantial minority of your populations to effectively second-class citizenship. And I just don't think that that's good enough. Anyway, that's the end of what I had to say. Thank you very much.